Welcome everyone to CGHE webinar number 316 webinar and seminar, but I think there's been well over 200 pure webinars. And we have with us John Aubrey Douglass today, which is great. I'll tell you about John in a minute. Let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube within a couple of days, maybe even quicker. And we're finding people are accessing it on YouTube even more than they're accessing it on the day of presentation. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or you're asking a question in the Q&A part of the webinar. And there's no need to have your video on either, but we would like you to turn it on when you ask your question. It makes it all more engaged and personal for everyone. To ask a question, you use the chat function. You write out the question you wish to ask or the statement you wish to make, and then I'll be able to select you into the Q&A on the basis of what's coming forward in the chat. So good time to start thinking of your question or your statement is towards the end of the presentation, which is usually around about halfway through the hour. And then you'll get into the conversation, because if you come in too late, if you come in the last 10 minutes, you may miss out. We recommend that during the webinar, you use speaker view so you can clearly see who is talking at any given time. And speaker view command, of course, is in the top right-hand corner of the screen, as you can see with the red arrow. Now, when we get to the Q&A part of the webinar, when John's finished his presentation, we'll start the process and I'll invite people in. I'll usually send them a warning message in the chat, so just for them to say that they will be invited in. And when you're invited in, please unmute yourself, most important step. Turn on your video and then state your name and where you are from, and then launch into your question or your statement. Well, let me now tell you about our speaker today. John Douglass is a Senior Research Fellow and Research Professor, Public Policy and Higher Education at the renowned Center for Studies in Higher Education in the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, a most important place in the history and the present of higher education studies. His most recent book is one which many people will know about, Neo-Nationalism and Universities, Populists, Autocrats and the Future of Higher Education, and that was published by Johns Hopkins in the US. He's also well known for his book, New Flagship Universities, which argued an alternative view of the what you might call the distinguished university category from the world-class university notion. And he's also a well-known historian of Californian model and Californian higher education, California idea, and American higher education, Stanford University Press, 2007 and 2000. He's a fellow of the New Institute at Hamburg, where he's working on the report, The Role of Universities in Promoting Democracy. So, central question, and John will tell us more about that today. Really happy to hand over to him.
Great, thanks so much, Simon. I'm going to do a little screen share here, so I get my little PowerPoint up. Appreciate the intro.
We can see that. That's good.
Okay, yeah, there we are.
So the full screen is there.
Okay, fantastic. So great to see Simon virtually. It was been some time since we actually saw each other physically before the COVID era. But so as Simon said, I'm working on this paper report as a fellow at the New Institute, which is a kind of advanced thinking multidisciplinary entity that's relatively new in Hamburg. And in doing that, I'm building off of some themes that are in the Neo-Nationalism and Universities book. And so I'm going to go through a little presentation on this and some themes that are coming out of the report, which is still a work in progress. But as all of you know, I'm sure, we've been seeing that democracy has been under attack in various parts of the world. Some have called it a depression. Is it a depression or is it worse? In terms of trend lines, VDEM is one of these measuring tools that looks at various aspects of the vibrancy of democracies, including, representation, government, voting, various categories. And they have, noted a significant decline in the number of vibrant democracies and the rise of illiberal democracies and autocratic governments. And, in that as well, you're seeing kind of, they have various subcategories. And I think there are some questions as to how they measure these things. But in any case, they do attempt to look at academic freedom and have various categories related to that. I think if you look at this map, this is supposedly 2021. I think the Russian category is closer to China now in terms of controls on civic liberty, civic rights and free speech and these kinds of things. So the trend lines have changed. There are also some elements related to Brazil. We looked at Bolsonaro for a period. We'll see if things change under Lula. But in any case, there's a kind of a general trend. And the question is, is it a depression or is it something that depression at least indicates that it's, there's a chance for recovery. So some of the themes that I also put in the book and looking at these series of case studies, they include places such as China, Hong Kong, Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, of course, the UK and the US in various forms. One of the things I kind of make an observation about, it's not incredibly revelatory, but is that universities are really good indicators of what's really going on in terms of the health of an open society in various parts of the world. The student demographics kind of give you a strong indicator of the levels of socioeconomic mobility. The autonomy of institutions relates to also, overall how governments are approaching their controls over other government agencies and life in general and businesses as well, extent of civil liberties, free speech. We see indicators, if that is not really an area of robust health, that's reflected in universities. And I kind of indicate this over in the book as well, is that these larger political issues in nation states really, like free speech really relates to academic freedom. It doesn't kind of go the other way around. The level of free speech offered in a particular society then reflects on the level of academic freedom. So this gets back to some themes I'm going to go through as to, what is happening, but also where we might go. Where can universities, as I say in the title, how can they promote? What's the role of universities in promoting democracy? And that's a tough question, and you have to kind of break it down. And I'll get into this first. So the book, as I said before, provides a kind of a comparative analysis, which has helped me, I think, organize my thoughts on this question. And I take in the book, and I continue in this report to take what I call a political determinist viewpoint. There are different ways of looking at things. Organizational theorists look at this things. You tend to be sociologists. Economists tend to look more at labor markets and various other kinds of factors related to universities. And I'm saying here that we need to pay a little more attention to the larger political milieu in which these institutions operate. That tells us a lot about their character and their effectiveness in the societies that they exist in. And so, in that role, I say national political history in the contemporary context is really a dominant factor. And I can be attacked for that, but I'm taking that stance for shaping the role of universities in society. And I'll kind of get into this briefly, that there is a spectrum of national and geopolitical environments universities operate in. And in the book, I tend to focus on neo-nationalism as a right-wing movement, but there's left-wing movements too, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and they have really similar in terms of transitory governments or whatever. They have their role in this story as well. And so the spectrum, a very simplistic way of thinking about it. I tried to figure out how could I organize thoughts about it. I did look a lot at political science literature and wasn't finding a lot of help in it, although there's obviously a lot of robust analysis about neo-nationalism and other things. But I couldn't find a framework that really helped me. So I just made this very simple conceptual idea that there's kind of this in the spectrum. There's nascent populist movements, political parties, nationalists leading governments, illiberal democracies, and authoritarian regimes. And they have their own characteristics to a certain extent. Here I'm mapping a little bit old because, obviously, I categorize slightly here a nationalist leading government more to the left side of the spectrum. When Trump was in power, he lost that election. We just had midterms, which were rather refreshing, although not, one doesn't want to take a victory lap. So things have changed some. Same thing also with Italy. It's gotten potentially worse, I should say. So they're transitional. Lula, I mentioned Lula and Bolsonaro, and that shift, that was razor thin, razor thin win by Lula. And there's a mixed story with Lula on higher ed and his story, but generally much better than Bolsonaro. So in this spectrum, I'm kind of noting in looking at where universities can play a role that there's a tipping point. There's kind of a place where universities can make a difference, of course, to the left of the spectrum, and that's where I'm going to focus more on, because the right part of the spectrum has different dynamics. But there's kind of this role of universities that can be consequential, but questionable at that tipping point, getting into liberal democracy. So it's just a conceptual idea. And so in the book, I'm not going to go through this, but I also kind of said, well, what are the characteristics of these different, when universities operate in these different spectrums? And there's lots of flaws in this outline. It's generally, you're seeing kind of, moving left to right. I have this with a plus, that you get over to the right wing, right side, it's including various things on the left side of this spectrum. But it's just a way of organizing thoughts and thinking about, well, what are the consequences of institutions when they're in these roles? So I'm just kind of putting this out as part of the analysis in the book. And also in the book, but now I'm going to use this in my little discussion about what universities can do to promote democracy. I also kind of went through this process of thinking, well, when are universities leaders or followers, or just intermediaries, something in between? And what I mean by that is that there's kind of lower tier things that universities do almost anywhere in some fashion that are really important. Labor force development, technological innovation and economic development, preservation of history, these kinds of things. And as you go up to tier 4, these are the more higher characteristics of a truly impactful university. This is obviously outside the realm of the global ranking structure. So I'm thinking about all the other things that universities do besides their research productivity, which is or reputation, which is largely the ranking game. Not completely, but a lot. And so I categorize these, and I said also there are different dynamics that help us explain where universities sit in the leader versus followers role. And academic freedom is really an important one. So just to give one example, how do institutions or universities pursue national history? If you're in the UK or in most of Europe, it's a pretty broad, open world in which to make interpretations about history. If you're in China, or if you're in Russia, there are very now strict rules about how you interpret history. With the Russian invasion, prior to the Russian invasion, there were laws passed about how and what extent one might be able to make comments about Stalin's role in World War II. So there's these kind of dynamics within this that are different between different kinds of institutional behaviors. But I put at the highest level the critical analysis of society, and I tend to usually use the word constructive critical analysis of society, not just things that make no sense, but really that are good analytical ways of looking at the world. So I use this model to some degree, and I can't get all into it because of time, to kind of say, well, here's that little mapping I just said, leaders, intermediaries, and followers. And I would generally say, in observation, in the European Union, and I would say that the paper I'm working on is largely focused on the European Union. I mean, I'm using broader scoping, but I'm kind of interested in this question of how universities can promote democracy in the European Union context, with some variations, obviously, there with a Hungary versus a Germany and others. But that's more my framework. And generally, they are liberal democracies, bordering on illiberal when you're talking about Hungary, but let's say the majority of European Union are liberal democracies. And so in looking at that scope or that area of where universities operate in that political spectrum, I offer a couple of observations in this paper that it will eventually be published by the new institute. At least that's my assumption. And one is that universities really, I mean, unfortunately, this is perhaps not the most incredible observations, but I have been looking at it and trying to look at the literature, scanning the literature, and there's lots of it, and especially in the last decade or so with the rise of more neo-nationalist movements. But there's a lot of literature out there, and I've scanned that and tried to observe it. It tends to be very nationalist oriented, a lot of things about the US and all that. It's usually pretty marginal conceptual ideas of what universities can do, in my opinion. But so I offered these three observations. Universities have few direct and immediate paths for promoting democracy, broadly defined. There are limits to their ability to promote democracy and civil society. I guess it's a bit repetitive. That any significant impact needs to be holistic and focused on meaningful interaction of universities with the societies they serve. So this plays into this conceptual idea, which we can argue about, is that universities need, in general, my observation is, in Europe and elsewhere, need to be more engaged with the societies they're intended to serve. And this is where I get a little bit into the criticism about global rankings. That there's, this has driven a significant amount of kind of looking at, and we want universities to be globally engaged. I'm not saying that, but perhaps not paying attention or focusing on research output and other kinds of influence in the societies that they're embedded in and intentionally are supposed to serve. So then I say this is a long-term project. If you will agree with me on that, we can debate it. And here are the areas in which I think universities can do more. Further developing an internal culture and organization that seeks greater engagement with the public. This is a general conceptual idea. Seek strategic efforts of engagement focused on our university's research, teaching, and public service mission. Pursue new efforts to increase the credibility and reputation of universities as sources of research and information and expertise as legitimate and influential sources of truth and knowledge. This fits into a lot of criticism or ways that people have looked at what's wrong, why universities aren't doing more to promote democracy, and then targeted approaches to promoting democracy, which I will tell you are very limited, super limited. So in the paper, I'm not going to get into this, I do categorize kind of what goes on internally in universities and what goes on externally, and a listing of taxonomy of different things a lot of universities are doing, or what universities might do in order to become more engaged. I'm not going to go through all of these. It's a pretty long list, and it's based on looking at around the world and what institutions are doing. And then, but on the European context specifically, I kind of outline the highlight ones that I think are potentially important. And I'm still, in a process of having people tell me whether they think this makes sense or not. So I have had some review of it, but I'm not pretending that I know all the answers. But I think this is in the general ballpark of what universities could do. And I'm not going through that list, but I will just completely, shortly, very quickly say a few things about three of them. Again, if you notice, I categorized this in relationship to my observations before, and a way of organizing thinking on it. And the one that I think is really significant, and I have written about this before in the new flagship university book as well, is the need to integrate more holistic approaches to faculty hiring and advancement or promotion. And this is a huge problem. I call it a misalignment of the mission of institutions with the practice of how incentivizing faculty and shaping their behaviors. And to be frank with you, it depends on where you are, the citation analysis and various forms of measuring output have dominated, not everywhere. In the UK, it's different than obviously Germany. And the UK is a little closer to the US model in this way, I suppose. But that there really is a problem here that needs to have a more holistic approach. And I list kind of categories in which universities can think about it, but it is a heavy lift because it's more qualitative. It means institutions internally have to have more organization about it. There are relationships with ministries depending on where you are and their demands. So there's a complex story there, but it is definitely the case, I believe, that there is a misalignment. And in that misalignment, there's not enough value placed on a public service role, including this concept of engaged scholarship, redefining areas of research that are important to the institution's mission, but don't necessarily stack up in measuring on citations, to the other forms of public engagement with local communities. And again, I'm focusing really, I do have a strong sense that universities need to at least recalibrate to some degree to focus on how they can best impact the world that they're regionally in as opposed to globally. I'm not discounting global side, that's really important. There are many global issues that are, that all institutions should be engaged in, but then the question is how many of them fit into really looking at what's needed locally, like climate change. So another area is adult continuing ed. Again, there's a tradition of this that comes out of Oxford and Cambridge and the UK, but I would say the US has taken it to a much more significant level. It's a much larger component in a lot of American public universities in particular. And this is a way of informing. And there are structural differences. I know in Germany, there's a lot of, there's kind of municipal government entities, but they're general and various other entities providing adult education broadly defined. And I do go through a kind of what are these different areas that there could be badges and certificates, what kind of audience, has to be some kind of marketing analysis, these kinds of things. So there's an area of also greater impact universities can have that, as I kind of try to say, is in this game, you find that it can increase credibility. One of the areas I didn't mention that does increase credibility, or at least this has been the focus for a lot of recent research, is that there's more impact or potential impact when you have a local researcher, let's say in Hamburg, where I was, working on climate change and is making, public statements or engaged in various forums about how it's impacting Hamburg. So the conceptual idea is that that's a more impactful actor than bringing in somebody from the US or some other point, that there's a relationships of people that live and work in a faculty member has a larger role potentially to play than bringing lots of outside experts. But so there's a whole story about that. Then finally, and I'm almost done here, relates to communication strategies. And this is also an area that a lot of people have been writing about. But the fact of the matter is most universities in Europe, at least, again, the UK is in a kind of different place and I don't understand all of it, but they don't have a communication strategy really. They're just starting to kind of build up offices that relate to it. But the argument partly is in some of the research is that we got to be more sophisticated about how we can, provide information about research and researchers and start thinking more about the different categories of people and how they think and how to communicate with them. So you're not just looking at communicating with your buddies, but you're trying to communicate to people who don't believe in climate change or these kinds of things. Again, all of this is a heavy lift, but we can be a lot more sophisticated in our communication strategies. So I just wanted to highlight those. So finally, my final slide is in the paper. I'm also trying to say, well, what can universities that are more on the illiberal democracy, autocracy spectrum, what can they do as intermediates, leaders, or followers? Or, I'm basically saying they're usually followers and intermediaries. They're just kind of they're supporting the existing political order, shall we say. And universities do that generally, but more so in a China or now in a Turkey, with the terrible purges that went on in Turkey in the academic field. So then the question is, well, what should be going on in Russia? What can Russian universities do in this particular environment? Not an easy question. there's really not a lot of room. I think we've also gone through this, I think others have called in various forms a neo-Cold War in various forms. I know Simon's written some on this too. And it was a good question, is like, well, what should be the relationship of European universities, and the Dutch, like, they have a particular viewpoint, and the Ukrainians. We just recently had a member of parliament here who has been a visitor before at our center and talk. And I said, well, what's the relationship with Russian universities should we have? And she was saying none. I was like, well, the older model was that we would maintain international networks, that we, we're trying to find ways to keep lines of communication open, but she was very adamant that that was not what should happen in the short term, at least. So there are different questions related to that. And then the other question is, well, what should we be doing, which I just kind of related to? What is it that universities in more liberal democracies, what can we do to assist those in Turkey or Iran or other places? And again, it's a complex question. So with that, Simon, that's my presentation.
Really good, John. And that opens up a whole bunch of issues that are really useful for us to discuss about higher education, its role and its relationship with the political culture. I want to, commend you on bringing forward your critique of the rankings briefly. And it was good to see that Yale and Harvard law schools have decided to bail out of US news. And that, the US news ranking of law schools is, has great currency in the US. And Yale has been at the top of that ranking for years and has said, no, this is not acceptable. The criteria that we're using to select students are not accurately represented here. The social responsibility of law schools is not given sufficiently importance in the ranking, for example. And so we're not going to cooperate. We're not going to provide data. And Harvard, who are equal fourth in the ranking, said the same thing. And Stanford had just batted it back and said nothing, but it was good to see. And, there's that exit from the Times Higher and QS going on in China at the same time. So I think there's some chance of problematizing rankings in a useful way with these big schools exiting from them. Also really liked your emphasis on the moral, agenda and the public service agenda. And people often talk about the birth of the modern university being Johns Hopkins in 1876, the research university imported from Germany, applied at Hopkins, developed, then becomes a prototype for the research intensive university worldwide. And I think you can defend that that analysis quite easily. But that moral act in 1862, which establishes the land grant university framework and the service function of the university and its democratization, is a really crucial moment, and in a lot of ways as important or more important than the Hopkins development. And
let me just
we're all
comment.
struggling to imitate still, I think. Go on, John.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I do talk in the new flagship book, but also in this paper I'm developing, there's a real big cultural differences. The concept of public engagement in various forms in a more limited way than we might think today is really part of the DNA of these early major public universities in the United States, because of the Morrill Act, which you note, which said basically we're funding these new institutions and providing funding from the federal government, in part to shape the economies of different regions of the nation, and to provide access, in theory, to working class and other forms of people. And this is, the red bricks, there's the tradition in this as well in the UK, but it really is a component that's there. So it's a little easier to build off that as opposed to the Humboldtian model, which, obviously is incredibly influential and important, but that you find that more in the continent. There's still this conceptual kind of a slow move towards a larger public role. And for various reasons, it's internal culture, but also maybe there are, as I noted in the talking about adult continuing ed, there are entities making up this gap. But I guess the question is, well, where are those areas in which universities can really expand? The other thing I note in the paper as well, I talk about governance issues, because this is an issue that we find and the relationship with stakeholders. This is an issue you find just everywhere in the world in the case studies that I've been engaged in, and in the book, the Neo-Nationalism book points out, is that this, these direct relationships with ministries has certain dynamics, and it removes them if they don't have other forms of interaction with stakeholders, with danger, I understand, about what is the autonomy of institutions, but this lack of really being linked to local stakeholders. Now that's changing as well in the continent, setting up various advisory groups, but if they don't have any real policy power, then sometimes they're very tangential.
Well, I think what you're seeing is some kind of splicing together of the Humboldt, framework, or the Hopkins framework with the land grant university tradition and this in public engagement. And where that's happening, it's through communication strategy, which you mentioned. It's through the process of bringing academic faculty, professors into the public environment and playing much more of a role as public actors, but also, of course, projects that are local. And you are seeing signs of that, I think, in Western Europe, of major universities starting to pay more attention to their regional and local obligation. The question I was going to raise with you, though, and I now see we've got people coming in, so I won't take much longer. It's really about academic freedom and civic and political freedom and the relationship between the two. My question is, I'll take the sort of devil's advocate position and say, to what extent can you read academic freedom from general political conditions of a country? What determines what? I mean, if you think the university sector has some autonomy, and I think it historically does at any given time, then it's possible for the two to be somewhat separated, not entirely. Clearly, political freedoms and conditions play a pretty important role long-term in sustaining conditions of the free operation of universities, but it's not quite that simple. I mean, because you could argue that academic freedom is about freedom to teach and freedom to learn and freedom to research and freedom to speak in the classroom and freedom to speak in academic circles. Now, the question is whether you assume that academic freedom simply means freedom to speak in public. And the difference is quite important if you look at different countries. It's possible I'd say the difference between China and Russia is important here. In Russia, anywhere you speak, if you're a university person, inside the classroom, in the town square, it doesn't make any difference. You get locked up right now. If you say anything against the war, anything against the regime, you're stomped on from on high. And university rectors are expected to eliminate the students who are politically active at the moment. But you can't teach either. You can't teach freely either. China, well, the big differences between what happens inside the classroom and what happens inside the scholarly circles, and the difference, and what happens in public. If you go public with your criticisms of policy, you're outside the pale. You'll be suppressed, you may be killed. If you operate within academic circles, though, behind closed doors, in a public sense, you have a lot of freedom. You can be quite critical, and you can be quite critical of contemporary policy, and you can be critical of the abolition of term limits for the president and things like that. You can say those things inside the university. So it's possible there, under some circumstances, to separate the two. And I wouldn't want to drive that too hard and say that you can have a flourishing academic freedom under illiberal political democracy, because I think there's really limits to that too. But when you're not going public, you're reducing a lot of what the university should and could do in the society. So I'm not making an argument that that's a defensible or desirable outcome. But I guess what I'm saying is you can separate to some extent the particularities of academic freedom from other forms of freedom. That it's a distinctive kind of freedom. So to simply make the argument that the universities is can become a kind of democratizing factor, it has some problems to it, because if in illiberal regimes, the university as a democratizing force goes out hard to try and change the society, the danger is that the epistemic freedoms, the teaching and learning and research freedoms, will be lost. And that I think has got a specific cost as well as a cost for democracy.
Well, I would just say that you pointed to a lot of the complexities out there, when I said some pretty simplistic things in my presentation, but and one is this debate about what is academic freedom in liberal democracies, which is an ongoing debate. We have it in the US, and obviously it's going on in Europe as well, and which deciphers a little bit what you were just saying about what is the professional rights of faculty in terms of the classroom, in terms of their internal discussions, and then what is their right to, as a voice outside of that in liberal democracies. And so that's an ongoing debate about that. Are they representatives of the university or not? And then when you transition over, but I think you just pointed out, I think a little bit what I've been saying is this larger, there are dynamics to academic freedom. Although my sense is, you may know better, but is that some of the things you were observing about the right to talk internally about the criticizing Xi is declining. It is shifting and changing very quickly, and it's very scary. But you know, it's a little hard for us on the outside to understand all of these things. But the larger milieu of civil of free speech and aspects of an open society, when they erode, they really reflect back on the institutions themselves, and you know, like there's government policy that relates to trying to control free speech. You know, the other thing I'll just notice, and this is an area in which I also discuss, and it's not an easy one to unpack, is the role of universities as nonpartisan actors, which, you know, and then we're getting into the difference between institutional actors that are leaders or whatever versus individual faculty and their academic freedom and rights. And so this is not an easy thing to navigate as well. You know, there's a lot of discussion, or some discussion, I should say, in the US that, you know, academic leaders, presidents of universities have traditionally been nonpartisans. They don't say, and most of the world, that's true, they don't say what their political party is. They don't line up behind a candidate, these kinds of things. But now there's more and more argument that they should take a larger role in, say, for example, abortion rights, or in climate change. But this aspect of the importance of institutions being in some form nonpartisan is important for their sustainability and their ability to impact society and have credibility. And in fact, you know, you look at like a Trump or whatever, he was really attacking constantly, not just science, but the credibility of the academic world. Oh, yes. And it worked, it really worked. And then we get into those dynamics of these tribalisms in politics. But this is also an area of real importance that needs to be thought of carefully by institutions.
Yeah, you're right, and you're right too about China. I think that it is harder to raise those internal criticisms now, from what I gather. But you know, the complexity of this and the fact that populism has currently got the universities on the back foot really fundamentally is the issue we have to get to terms with. And also, and I suspect sustainability and climate change in the end is going to be such a giant issue that the university, with its role in nurturing science, is such a central actor in that problem that these issues are going to be raised very, very sharply in future.
Well, I'll only say this, getting back to communications, both about what universities are doing in terms of their activity in research and other forms, teaching in local problems like climate change, is that I'm advocating here, it's not easy, that we're not just talking to constituencies that we know are in our realm of thinking. That how do universities think about their relationship? And again, it varies on where you are in the world and the structure of the higher system. How are you talking to other components of people or parts of our public that really need convincing? Not that you're going to succeed, but you got to think about it.
You got to talk to them.
Yeah, and we have really poor communication structures or helping to facilitate, you know, it really comes down to actors, faculty, are they getting out? Students, are they out working with the local community in scale or in ways that really are impactful? It's, again, it's easy to say these things, to organize and do them. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do in this paper, and I did in the flagship. I'm trying to say, well, here are the issues, but then here, what are examples, programmatic examples of how universities can and are doing work, not just talking about it theoretically. So, but that's the heavy lift: funding, organization, value within that it's part of the culture of the institution to some degree. Not everybody has to do it, just that there is an institutional effort in this realm.
Yeah, we have our own echo chambers too, and we're guilty of working to our echo chambers as much as anyone is. So we have to get outside them. I mean, that's absolutely right. I'm now going to bring in a batch of questions each time because we've got so many people who want to talk and have got interesting things to say. So I'll bring in 3 people at once now. I'm going to bring in Lisa Wheelerhan and Pete Lehigh, and also Jonah Otto. So be ready, Jonah, because I know that our Pete and Lisa are already ready. I'll bring in 3 people at once. Lisa, you're first.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for a really interesting presentation. I thought it was great. You focused on the university as an institution. Perhaps you could talk about the role of the public intellectual and what their role is in this whole process, and how universities can support them. I know with the establishment of the conversation, which I'm not sure if everyone knows what that is, but it's in many countries now. It started in Australia, but it's a framework where academics publish their work in a way that's accessible for the public to access. That I think that's been very important in reestablishing the notion of the public intellectual, but I'm just wondering if this is something that we should be focusing on to a greater extent to help achieve some of the objectives that you're talking about.
So hold your answer, John. No, John, wait.
Oh, sorry.
I've got 2 more. Pete Leahy. Yeah, you're next, Pete.
Yes, great. Thank you. Speaking of public intellectuals, Steve Bannon got Donald Trump to define himself as a populist and a nationalist in a speech while he was running for president. And of course, populist is often associated with a sort of left aesthetic, and nationalist is often associated with a right-wing aesthetic. Nobody really knew what Bannon meant or what Trump meant, but it did seem to be a bit of an attack on the educated, on the eggheads in the Eisenhowerian sense. Could you comment on that in terms of the presentation of Trump and his ideology?
Hold it, John. Jonah Otto, please.
Hi, thanks. A couple times during the presentation, you had mentioned, or at least alluded to the idea that international and global aspects of higher education don't have to be at odds with what you're looking at in your push to kind of localize the impact and engagement of universities. In what way can international and global things then be helpful or instrumental in this process? I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Well, there's 3 distinctive questions, John, so over to you.
Okay, I don't think I have fantastic things to say about public intellectuals. Of course, we want to support them. Most public intellectuals, at least in the world I live in, tend to be, out there writing, I guess we could call them Malcolm Gladwell at some degree. We could argue about those things, but so they're out and about. And I do know the conversation, but I didn't realize that the conversation was being replicated in other parts of the world. That the aspect about that is that, what it's doing, and you can find other outlets to write in, but, I think it is the, copyright law in the US, it can be republished in various forms without, being paid. So there are ways in which this is helping distribution of the public intellectual. I think a lot of the things in the conversation are actually from academics. So you're asking the question, those outside of academia. So yeah, they're part of this equation, absolutely. But I won't pretend that I've really, thought heavily about it. I think they fit into this discussion in terms of interaction with universities. If they are outside of the university, that the universities are support structures for them, platforms for them to come and speak. And I do, getting back to the question of free speech and academic freedom, I do try to delve a little bit into, what is it that, how can universities, and this is a general criticism, how can universities be seen more as public squares that are open to legitimate, this is not the word, legitimate debate about conservative values and ideas versus liberal or whatever. I'm not talking about supporting neo-Nazis, but that we have an image problem, and also that we need to have more kind of thinking and efforts to make sure that we have public debate and access, not just faculty, but people that come and interact with the university or from more conservative side. And this gets into the problems. There are a lot of internal problems, and I know a little bit about this, about the culture of institutions and sometimes their intolerance of anything but a very strict liberal view. So that's a generalization. So the other question was about Trump, and I don't know, I think we're just both talking the same language. I mean, Trump, the second week into his new presidency, looked at the events Berkeley had that relates to this first question about open debate at the institution. There were young Republicans at Berkeley invited a series of very right-wing, populist, non-constructive, shall I say, political people, and there was this gigantic infighting. We had Antifa on campus burning, so the left was there burning trash cans and breaking windows and fighting with the Trump people. I mean, most of the people on the campus weren't from the university at all, which is not an unusual thing that occurs. And Trump just lit into that right away as part of this liberal bastion of institutions. And the thing about that is, what I would say is that, of course, this guy's a demagogue. He's, fire and burn and slash everything and attack everybody. I mean, this is a very upsetting person as a political actor. But, he touches a little bit on something that is true a little bit. And that is, that universities sometimes aren't being as open. And this may be more of a US issue than perhaps it is in Germany and other places. I don't know that for sure, but he lit right into it. And so that helped, there's data that shows polling that Republicans are worried that, on general, that, sending their children to universities, if they're not evangelical institutions, or just being, told what to think and to become leftists and all of that kind of thing. So generally what we're seeing is, if you take Trump and then say there's Orban, or Turkey would be a little different in that regard, because Erdogan used the coup attempt to purge a wide swath of what he viewed as his opposition in some form. But you see this general pattern of populists blaming and seeing elite intellectual as really forced to be contained. So I don't know if I added much to that. On the international side, I'm writing a section to say I'm not trying to devalue international engagement, which is actually absolutely vital in the global world, and that we have all these global risk issues that are significant, pandemics, climate change, water quality, and democracy to some degree. So the importance of international connections relates a little bit more, again, to as well. What's our relationship with Turkey? Academics in Turkey or Russia or in China, as China has gone more and more down the Xi path. And all of those interactions, not just in terms of joint research, but just networking, are all part of a vital component of the modern university and intellectual development. And so these, networking and exchanges are really important. So, and its integration into curriculum as well is very important. So there's lots of points of relationships to promoting democracy that are there as well. So.
That was pretty good, John. You got through those three very well. I'm going to give you three more now.
I tried. Why did you speak up?
So we got our next question will be from Milica Popovic, who's already on screen, so ready to go. Then we'll have Mokhadil, and then we'll sorry, I'm very sorry. We've got Serap as well. Serap Emil. I might take Serap first, actually, if that's okay, Milica, because Serap was first in the line. Serap, are you there, please?
Oh, I am, but it looks upside down, right?
Isn't that great? Yeah, yeah.
All right, that's
You
fine.
must be in the
because
southern
I'm outlook-
hemisphere.
I don't know what happened.
Are you in the southern hemisphere? Or?
I'm from Turkey.
Oh, okay. All right.
Ankara. Yeah. It's funny. I'm gonna try as I am speaking, so I don't want to take too much time. Serap from Ankara Middle East Technical University, and I just got a message from my WhatsApp groups. It's a very good example to what you were talking. There is this conference, International American Studies Conference at Hacettepe University, and then the conference name is Trans America. And because there's a word trans, and because there's high sensitivity in Turkey LGBT+, they changed the name.
Okay.
I would say very example of what you think. My question was, what if we don't political ideology of oppression, the institution itself, from the institution, from the leaders. I think that's what we are experiencing right now. It feels like universities act as the extension of the current political ideology, and they are basically, we don't need them. We have rectors, we have, university leaders, we have even followers who are acting in the same way. So what are we going to do with that? So that was my question, and thank you, and sorry for the upside down.
Did you get the sound, John? I had some problems with my
Yeah, I
end.
had some problems, but I think I
got the
can
gist of it?
formulate a response. Yeah.
Wait, we'll bring in Melika now. Melika Popovic, please.
Simon. So yeah, I'm Milica Popovic. I'm postdoctoral fellow at the Global Observatory on Academic Freedom at the Central European University in Vienna now. And actually currently at the University of Warwick as a visiting fellow. And I'm gonna take a stand maybe from just a little bit of a different perspective, because of course all these countries, the illiberal regimes, populist regimes, especially within this fora, it could be also preaching to the choir. We all agree that there has been a very significant development in diminishing democracy, and of course it always goes in parallel with attacks on academic freedom. But what might seem for me even more worrying is that the rise of neo-nationalism is something that we can see also in so-called liberal democratic regimes, and attacks on academic freedom are happening as we speak, also in the countries that we wouldn't usually look at when we are discussing these phenomena. And we can only look at the United Kingdom, where we see the freedom of speech bill currently being in the procedure of parliament, against which a number of academic community is raising serious concerns, not to talk about specific cases like the academic Karen Fowler, for example, that we have witnessed, or in France, where we had the situation of the government and even the Minister of Higher Education directly stating attacks in the name of so-called Islamo-gauchism as a phenomena at French universities. And I think this is what's, I would say, the most worrying issue to look at the moment, that there seems to be an attack on academic freedom throughout different regimes. So I would just be interested to hear your comment on that. Thank you very much, Simon and John.
Yeah, and I totally agree with the question. I think that's really excellent, and it does broaden out the issues. Mohidil, you're next, I think, and about 3 questioners. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for your very interesting presentation. I'm Mohidil Saliva, PhD student at University of Surrey, currently looking at micro-level political outcomes of international higher education. So my question is with regard to my topic. So higher education is a proxy, sometimes is argued to be proxy, sometimes kind of to have potential to develop political culture of students, because students are in their impressionable years. So I was wondering if you have considered or looked at how international students or how universities abroad for international students promoting political culture development, or does university have potential to develop political culture of international students? Because we know from the history of international scholarship schemes, for example, Fulbright, Chevening. So these are the scholarships where soft power of hosting nations are very much so promoted. So I was wondering if you have looked at this, or just if you have any kind of intentions to develop this idea. So what are your thoughts, your own thoughts on this? Thank you very much.
Over to you, John.
Okay, yes. On the issues that were mentioned in Turkey, yeah, you just see this in various forms. I know that in Turkey that after the purge after the coup and then the purge, that many academics were either fired or they lost their passport or these kinds of things. The comment I wanted to make was that you see in Turkey a pattern which I discuss in the Neo-Nationalism book as well, a playbook, shall we say, in which you see autocratic, illiberal leaders or autocratic leaders move more and more. And this, I should note, there are some examples in the liberal democracies as well. And I'll return to that. But forcibly taking out rectors or moving towards appointing them directly. I know in Turkey they had moved towards internal selection of rectors, which is good and bad in various ways. But that there's then an effort to make sure that the leadership is towing the line of the government, and that's also the case. I mean, it was always a structure to some degree to have a party leader in China, but you've also seen the boards of various institutions have more and more people that are devout to the party or explicitly so. And this kind of burbles down to the hiring process and other forms of kind of censorship of what academics can do. And just in a related issue, because I think this is talking about, well, what can we do, or what is the circumstance of universities in China? I'm sorry, in Russia or Turkey, is shortly after or just before the coup attempt, there was Academics for Freedom listing, trying to were protesting against the treatment of Kurds, and that was a significant list that then became basically a blacklist used by the government itself to help them figure out who to fire. And there's a similar action, not to the same extent, that's going on in Russia, that a number of academics in various associations with the academies signed protest letters about the invasion of Ukraine, and then that became also a source of blacklisting. So this is just an interesting, worrisome dynamic. Academics, should they have, as a leaders of or important citizens, should they immediately go out and protest something that's obviously wrong in some form, but what are the consequences for them and what happens to them? So I just wanted to make a few of those comments related to Turkey. The other question was, which is a good one, and I didn't mean to neglect that, about what is going on in academic freedom in liberal democracies, or what we might call liberal democracies. And there's plenty of examples in the US with Florida. I don't know if you're aware, there's a bit of movement of, there's this kind of conservative group that promotes various forms of legislation to be repeated in various parts of, in various other, what we call red states. And some of them are all related to, the teaching of racism, not just in K through 12, but also in at universities. So yes, I'm very aware of that. I didn't mean to diminish it, and it is a topic both in the book, because we look at issues such as what happened with the process at Brexit, Trump in the US. We do have case examples of Hungary, but we also have Germany, and looking at AfD and various regional impacts of these right-wing movements. So I'm very conscious of what you're saying, and it is absolutely important that these are also areas in which academic freedom is being eroded. As I said before, I do still want to kind of look at that question about, well, what are universities doing to promote a broad conceptual idea of academic freedom as well, not just protecting it in a traditional sense, but becoming a little bit more active in legitimate debate across the spectrum. I don't want to overemphasize that, but it is conceptually important, I think. So then finally, the final was about the impact of international students themselves. Yes, I think I don't know of really good data or analysis about, well, what is the cultural impact of international students when they say come to the US and then go back to China or something of that nature. And we have a lot of anecdotal stories, but I'm not aware of any good data. But this is a general problem with international education, is that we don't have a lot of information about its overall impact, and it's hard to get at. And we really need to do more work. I will say we have done a little bit of work through what I'm the founding PI of something called the Student Experience and a Research University Consortium, and we do survey work. We've been doing it since about 2002 in the University of California, but now we have international members, including Peking, and we have about 4 universities in China, some Northern European universities. Maybe we may have leads that's coming into our group, but in any case, we have data that drills down to various subpopulations, and we've looked at that question of like, what's also the impact of international students on domestic students in their worldview. It's not an easy question to get at, but we did look kind of at survey data about that, and it is a positive, but more generally, we really do need more careful work about the plus side of international students in various parts, besides being cash cows in certain parts of the world. We kind of know it intrinsically, but we don't have a lot of good work on it.
John, I think we usually go 5 minutes over, and I think we've got time for one more question. So I'd like to bring in Aki Yanazawa from Japan at this point. And Aki, can you come in, please? Good, there you are.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much, John, again, and that's a very, very stimulating discussion. So I'd like to know more about your idea of democracy, not only limited to the academic freedom. So compared with the academic freedom, maybe the democracy has, at the time, has a quite different meaning in the different contexts and different country. And under this condition, the social science and humanities in the university relatively kind of the very good media to share the common idea among the different countries, because at least that the kind of the characteristics of the academic work that we examine and criticize and analyze, right? So and then under this condition for the politicians or some powers, it is relatively easy to make an indirect attack to the academic freedom and autonomy through the attack to the humanities and social sciences, or just to stress the STEM simply means that we don't give the resources to the humanities and social sciences. That kind of discussion is occasionally happening. So could you tell that what do you think about the relationship between the social science and humanities and your role of the university in the democracy? Because maybe it is not that big issue considering the social engagement in the United States that is basically based on the kind of democracy based on the grassroots. But this is not exactly true for the other country. Thank you.
Well, let's see. First, Aki, it's great to see you again from a distance. Yeah, I don't know if I can if I fully grasp the aspects of what you were talking about. I think if the question is, what is the role of social sciences and humanities in terms of having academic freedom in various societies, and we could say, let's say Japan versus California. Like California is kind of a society to itself to some degree, and China. I think these are really important components of a reflection both of the political environment in which academics are working in, but also what are their opportunities to shape discussions and public debate in some form. And it seems to me that, if that was somewhat the question, then, there are real limitations for those in China. I mean, Simon was talking about the conceptual idea that you could talk about it in private. And I know that used to be, at least that was my experience too. You could go have dinner and we could have a pretty honest discussion, but that seems like that era has kind of gone away. So maybe the other part you're saying is that there are different conceptualizations of what academic freedom might mean. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm not absolutely sure I know what it means exactly. Final note, because I do have some colleagues working on this, and I have some experience in working with academic freedom issues at the University of California. And that is, you know, beyond our general statements of academic freedom or our look at the external world that's attacking it in various forms, shall we say, it's a question of, well, what are the policies of universities and how are they enforced? Or shall I say regulated or some form? And my colleagues are doing a survey of looking at, well, what are the statements universities have about academic freedom? And, you know, some have signed on to the, you know, the Haifa statement, if you remember that. We had the C9, what was that, like 15 years ago? The C9 and plus, you know, the president of AAU signed on to it. Very generically good, but look at that. I mean, that is like not important. So what are the institutional policies that relate to it, and how do they deal with conflict that comes up? And their findings basically is that very few universities have any significant statement. In the United States, they often just go kind of refer to, there's a statement that came out, oh gosh, I'm forgetting, 1914, I think, by the AAUP, the Association of American Universities Professors, in an earlier era when professors were occasionally, and when at Stanford, I should know, was fired for being, you know, not politically correct in that era. So that's a really important component of this, is what are the university's policies? How do they mesh with perhaps cultural understandings of academic freedom? And then what are the procedural aspects within the institution to protect that? Because the academic freedom has a wide range of potential meanings. Yes, it can be about me saying something about how bad Trump is while he's president, or it could mean that I might say something really bad about the president of the University of California, right? Or other forms. So that's a really important area of work that needs to be done by institutions themselves, I think. So I'm sorry if I didn't answer everything in your interesting question.
I just wanted to say that term democracy is different with the academic freedom. So the democracy has much more meaning, or the quite different idea, right? So although sometimes it is possible to say that the democracy doesn't need academic freedom in a very kind of but anyway, so thank you so much. It's really.
But you think democracy doesn't need academic freedom? You don't think academic freedom is like civil, like free speech?
Yeah, so that if you go into the very extreme populism, that could be happen. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with Aki. I mean, I think I was trying to make that point, and I think Malika was trying to make that point too, that there's some decoupling between, you know, political forms in general and political culture and the specific forms of academic freedom. And the two are obviously interconnect and intertwined in quite complex ways, as you said, John, and but we can't necessarily read one from the other. And you know, it's a discussion which we'll go on having, I think. I want to thank you very much. I've got two thanks and one apology, actually. You know, thanks to John. I think this is one of the best discussions we've had in the whole program, and this issue can run and because it raises so many issues for us about the nature of our political systems, about the character of HE, higher education itself, and about the relationships between higher education and our political systems and the civil society. And, you know, that really gets to the heart of many fundamental issues. And I think your work in general, you know, does all of that as well. And we're very interested, I think many of us are very interested in what you're doing, and would like to discuss, you know, the flagship university issue, for example, further with you and so on. So we hope you come back on the webinar series. We'd like to have you back more than once. And, you know, if you could stimulate the audience like you did today, yeah, it'd be well worth doing from our point of view anyway. I want to also thank everyone for staying a bit longer today. Thank you very much. And my apology is to Adriana, who missed out, at being the last person who came in when everyone came in very quickly. Didn't come in very late, but we had so many people wanting to speak today that because John stimulated so much thought, I think, that we couldn't fit everyone in. Our next webinar is we go back to Ukraine, and our presenter will be Yulia Zayachuk from Ivan Franko National University, Lviv, and she'll be talking next Tuesday at 2 p.m. in the UK, now on normal time, off summertime. So we look forward to seeing everyone then. And all I can say again is thank you, John, and bye to everyone for now.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Bye-bye.